some changes taking place, good changes, and we still have a lot of way, a long way to go where Africa is concerned in terms of publishing. But with people like Ellah and Goretti, I'm very hopeful. I don't want to mention someone else in the audience because I didn't tell her I will, so let me shut my mouth. But you have Story Moja in Kenya, you have Kachifo Farafina, which is the name many people know in Nigeria, you have Cassava Republic, and you have Kwani in Kenya. So I think the more of these things that we have being led by Africans, the more hopeful we can get about publishing from Africa, by Africans, for Africans. So I would like to introduce my panel. I can still remember my left and right. On my left is Goretti. You have to teach me how to pronounce your name.
Goretti.
Goretti.
You have to say it like an Italian.
Oh, yeah. Goretti. Okay. And your surname is?
Kyomuhendo.
Okay. Hey! I'm in love already. And on my right is Allfrey. She's the deputy editor for GRANTA. But Goretti does a lot of work in publishing. So sometimes you just have to present people and let the audience decide. Goretti was born and raised in Hoima, Western Uganda. She's an award-winning author of 2 novels, The First Daughter and Secrets No More. She was a founding member of FemRights, designing and implementing many of its first writing and publishing projects. And I also know she does a lot of work here in the UK, connecting and networking people. Ellah, as I said, is the deputy editor of GRANTA. She used to be with Random House, I believe. And there are some books out there which I know she has edited, really good stuff by writers of African descent. And she was senior editor at Jonathan Cape, where she introduced a list of young African writers. And one of the curators here is on that list. So, without further ado, I hand over to Goretti.
Thank you, Belinda. First of all, I'd really like to thank the curators of this event, Nay, Parks, and his childhood friend, Will. It's really important that we should have such events for African writing. I keep saying that at times I feel so bad when I'm invited to go to to literature events in Europe or America, and there are only 2 or 1 African writer or publisher in an audience of about 100 or even 150 people. So for me, this is important that we have people like me who keep the beacon on African literature shining. So I'm really very grateful that you managed to pull off this together. So this is a broad subject which we were given to talk about, and which is good because it gave me the leeway to pick out what I'm very passionate about. So I'm going to speak very briefly about African publishing in Africa. African publishing in Africa. What is happening when you take a cursory look at the African publishing landscape inside the continent. Belinda has already mentioned the initiatives that I was going to talk about. Initiatives like Story Moja Publishers, who are based in Kenya, Farafina, based in Nigeria, and Cassava Republic, and Amelion Publishing, which is based in Senegal, and the Horn Publishers is a new initiative in Somalia. And I would also want to talk about, just briefly about material books, because I can see Kate Haynes, who is really doing a brilliant job in Rwanda with the local Rwandese writers and publishers. And FemRight, of course, which is my first love. FemRight Publications is in Uganda. It's a women writers support group and publishing house, which I helped to found 15 years ago now. So all these initiatives are happening on the continent and publishing books. So what does this mean for me? For me, this is hugely positive that such things are happening on the continent. Because what it means is that African writers and publishers, as African writers and publishers, we are beginning to move away from the margins. Because what happens, I've lived in Uganda for nearly all my life and only moved to this country in 2007, which is about 5 years ago. So when you write from a marginalized literature, and if you're based on the continent, the center is always somewhere else. When I was writing and publishing in Uganda, we all aspired to get published outside Uganda. We never ever looked at the continent or Uganda as the center of publishing. So for me, when these initiatives have started to happen, it means as African writers and publishers, we are beginning to move away from the margins. We are beginning to get actively involved in the ownership of our literary and publishing activities, not always looking up to somebody else to publish our books. We are beginning to organize our own writing and publishing activities. And I think for me, more importantly, as I've already said, is all this means we are beginning to create our own centers of gravity in Africa. When I first moved here in 2007 and then returned to Uganda to give a reading from my new book, which had been published the same year, and it was a group of young university students. Then one of them asked me, so why did you move to the UK? So my moving here was completely personal and related, but not the only reason to do with my writing. So I said, it was for personal reasons, which I really wouldn't want to discuss with the audience. And then she said, is it true that as an African writer, you need to move out from the continent if you want to get published, if you want to win a literary award? So I found that question very tricky, because I couldn't dispute what the statistics were pointing to. That's the reality, that majority of African writers, successful African writers, live outside the continent, have been published internationally outside the continent. So, it's still a disturbing fact for me that do we need to move from the continent to come to Europe, to go to America, in order to catch the attention of a powerful Western publisher, in order to win the great literary awards? So my answer to that is yes and no. And what makes me even more positive is that something is beginning to happen on the continent. But having said all that, I also need to say that we must recognize that the challenges are still there. Even with all these initiatives happening, even as we strive to create our own centers of gravity as far as publishing is concerned on the continent, there are still challenges. For example, how can we increase readership in Africa? Because I think that is a big problem. And how can we expand our book markets? Because the book markets are still very narrow. In Uganda, for instance, even for a best-selling novel, it takes at least 2 years to sell 1,000 copies, even for the best-selling title. If you go to the bookshops, they'll only take 10 copies to stock in their shelves. And the 10 copies will take anything between 6 to 8 months to sell. So how can we expand our markets in Africa? When I worked with Femwrite, where we used to publish women's fiction, we were selling more books in Europe and America than in Africa put together. It was that bad. It's nearly impossible to get a book published in Uganda across the border to Malawi or to Ghana, for instance, because of the infrastructure problems. So how can we expand our book markets on the continent? Then how can we make our publishing activities more commercially viable? Because as I've already mentioned, it really is not, it doesn't make much business sense to sell a title, a good selling title of 1,000 copies in 2 years and plus. Sometime. Okay. So I want to close my presentation just touching briefly on what I think are the gaps after talking about the opportunities and what's happening on the continent. And I've been thinking a lot about genre fiction and wondering why is not that popular among African writers, or in Africa. I know there is some of it happening, science fiction, I think, in South Africa and Zimbabwe. but why don't we write about it? You know, why is it that we never think about it? I've published 3 novels, and it has never occurred to me to write about romance, or fantasy, or science fiction, or witchcraft, or vampires. It really has never occurred to me, and I don't know if I'll pull it off. And I just want to say that I think because, you know, many of us on the continent, when we started writing, when I came to writing, for example, I was coming from literature. I had studied literature in secondary school. And when I started writing, you know, my main focus was to imitate the writers I've been reading, who had been, of course, writing literary fiction. You know, the Ekwensi, the Ekwensi, the Ngugis, and all the big names. So when I started writing, I just imagined I have to imitate these good writers. Science fiction, romance, and fantasy is not taught in secondary schools in Africa. So I never imagined that if I read Mills and Bourne, but I always imagined that is not in my culture, that is outside my culture. So I can't write about it. I can read about it, but I can't write about it. Then I think the other reason, I think, is to do with readership and publishing. Because in Africa, the publishers will always point you to writing literary fiction. Why? Because they know, they want something that will end up in schools and universities, to be taught on the reading list, and also to win the literary prizes. I've not had any romantic novels in Africa winning a literary prize or being taught in secondary schools. So the publishers will always point you in that direction, you know, write literary fiction. But I think that we are beginning to move away from this phenomenon of you know, a mindset textbook or literary fiction. I think last week, or maybe 2 weeks ago, I got an email from Kwani Trust. And what was it? It was a call for submission of romantic novels. Actually, they call them sex stories. They call them sex passionate stories from East Africa. I said, yes, we are getting there. I think I'm going to stop.
Thank you, Goretti. I'm trying. Now we're going to hear from Ellah about the same topic, genre fiction.
Quite hard to follow that last statement. I want to start off also by thanking me and Will. Mostly I want to thank you for pushing me into sort of putting down on paper things that I've been vaguely thinking about on my bus rides and, you know, from work and home and whatever. And I'm grateful to Goretti for a lot of our talk will overlap, but I'm grateful that you've sort of laid things out so clearly, because I'm going to start off by telling everyone a story. My father is a writer, and he's also been a journalist and a translator and a publisher. This summer, while sitting in the garden receiving friends and relatives who'd come to pay their respects and to say hello during his visit to London, I listened to him telling a story that I'd never heard before. One that, looking back, tells me a lot about how I became the person I am. I sit at a desk in an office filled with books. I sleep on a bed atop piles of books, those books that I must read, the books that I must read, the books I'll read when I have a minute, Christmas reading, etc. And I live in a house with severe bookshelf issues, and I'm not going to bore you with tales of my basement. My father grew up in Mbare, in what was then Rhodesia. His father was a bicycle messenger for the city of Salisbury, as it was known, and his mother, my namesake, was a market trader. For the children of Mbare, especially those including my dad from poor families, church organizations provided education and entertainment. The story my father told us this summer was of Sister Barbara, who ran an afternoon boys' club where children of the township could play ping pong, hang out, and learn. Most importantly, the club had a library. And it was Sister Barbara who, in handing over first one novel and then another, allowed a young Pius Wakatama to discover the magic that one can find in the pages of a book, taking him far beyond the restrictions of family situation, the poverty that meant he didn't go to high school when his better-off classmates did, and the apartheid-style caliber in Rhodesia that would do its best to thwart the ambitions of a boy like him. He read the books, and he went back every day for more. Then he got a job selling newspapers and magazines, including the famous Drum magazine, which for a long while was the home of the short story in Southern Africa. Louis Nkosi, the great South African writer, described the magazine's young writers as urbanized, eager, fast-talking, and brash. This was my father's tribe. My dad is not an entirely modest man. I took a look at these stories and I thought I could do better, he says, matter of fact, with a slight challenge to his voice. And he did. Soon he was making his living selling short stories to newspapers and magazines, and then going on to write a clutch of Shona novels. It's always a source of immense pride for me, whose Shona is at its best that of a very intelligent 15-year-old, when I meet people who recognize my family name because they were taught his books in school. The point of the story, and its relevance for our conversation today, is this. Because Sister Barbara handed a young tearaway a book and captured his imagination, or perhaps more accurately, unleashed it, I grew up in a house full of books, where people didn't think it odd when one wanted to read, not talk, where the writing life was commonplace and ideas and the discussion of ideas that comes in an environment of active engagement with books was encouraged. The first stories my father read were by Mark Twain, Charles Dickens, and they were set far away from the realities of his life. But the fact of words on paper and the magic of just how far these words and stories could travel geographically and through time told him that there were other possibilities out there. And there was the possibility that his own stories could find their way into books and into the hands of readers. I've been asked in the recent past to write and speak about the new in African literature, and I confess I find it hard to resist. I love talking about books and I like making lists. But even as I witter joyously about the new African fictions that bring us the sleuths Zinzi December and Ishmael Fofana, who Goretti had mentioned, science fiction and crime set on the continent, as organizers of today's talk have stated, there were others before. We are not the first generation who has discovered the might of an imagination set free, but we are, perhaps, the first generation with the potential to encourage these imaginations to greater achievements and success than ever before, and to do so on the world stage. As a reader, I'm always looking for the next fix, and every once in a while, I want it to be a story that brings me back home, or one that holds a mirror up and reflects a face that looks like mine. Of course, we find our home in different places, and at the best of times, we can see ourselves in other people. But here I'm specifically talking about the deep sense of identification I experienced reading Silangarewa's Nervous Conditions. The same feeling, though of a very different texture, I had on discovering Octavia Butler and her Xenogenesis trilogy. For me, and I know it's probably true for many of you in this room, books are a refuge, a solace, and a portal, and I want as much variety as possible. But beyond this voracious promiscuity as a reader, I'm also an editor and a publisher, and my job allows me to make the kind of books I want to read, or at least some of them, to find writers and stories, and sometimes to put the two together myself, and to find ways to bring those stories to their readers. But just as I'm aware, while happily tabulating lists of the best and the new from Africa, that there will be gaps and omissions, so too am I aware as a publisher that a focus on the literary and commercial branches of fiction does not truly represent the imaginative potential we know is out there. This summer I had a series of long conversations with Binyavanga Wainana, and I think this is where the sexy stories come from. A writer and publisher I greatly admire for his ingenuity and unbridled enthusiasm and his determination to make things new. We started off discussing the recent reissues of Kojo Laing's work by the Heinemann African Writer Series, for which we both provided introductions. I came to Laing's work myself lamentably late, and I accepted the invitation to introduce the book because I knew it would be a difficult task and I was in need of something just like that. Binya and I discussed how reading Laing shows you that there's nothing new under our sun. In his work, which is deeply serious and political, highly satirical and full of fun and exuberance, one will find fable and folklore, steampunk and the whispers of the Gothic in the tradition of Mervyn Peake. It challenges the hapless critic to find a suitable category and then it defies it. Laing is the reader who teaches you is the writer who teaches you how to read. And so, like two junkies sharing information on where to score the best gear, we moved on to where else one could find this level of challenge and satisfaction. And because we are both manufacturers as well as consumers of words, we wondered what we would do to encourage the writers of African descent. And I hope you're all noticing that I'm sidestepping the African writer label, because I don't want lots of messages on my Twitter feed after this. Nyavanga and I wondered how we would encourage those writers who are longing to tell ghost stories and to tell us romances, erotic tales, and crime. The last 10 years alone has seen a dramatic change in the reception of books by and about Africans. One no longer has to head straight to the back of the bookshelf to the lesbian, gay, and black books. Now we can find Brian Chikwaba, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Chioma Okereke, Ngugi, and many others right there on the fiction shelves, or in the buy one get one free promotions, where they belong. When a huge talent like Novala Bulawayo, winner of the Kane Prize, submits her novel, it is as a writer represented by a top international literary agency, and the submission instigates an international bidding war. It's clear to me that at least at the high end of literary fiction, Africans are holding their own, and the innovation of language, the telling of stories that feel new, and the sheer commercial potential of this talent means that the moment has come. And so how to do that moment justice? It's important to be realistic. We are speaking here in London from the economic and political, far away from the economic and political realities of publishers and booksellers in Kampala, Lagos, or Windhoek. When I published B. Bandele's Burma Boy, his insistence that it had to be available in Nigeria and people had to be able to afford the book meant that colleagues at Random House conjured up a new publishing model that would allow for a profitable, and that's a key word here, co-edition with African publishers. The Kane Prize Anthology now has similar arrangements with Weaver Press in Zimbabwe, Kwani in Kenya, Femrite in Uganda, to name a few. These are just two examples. And while the creation of new publishing models now allows for writers published in the West to ensure their books are available in the countries that they or their parents call home, it's a flow in one direction. What would happen if the energy that produces soap operas, music, and films that form African pop culture were applied to literature? How do we channel the potential of new digital platforms and ubiquitous technologies, such as the humble mobile phone, to help writers tell their stories and to make a living doing so? Can we get to a stage where we have not only Dreams in a Time of War and Half of the Yellow Sun available to an international audience, but also maybe Nairobi Nights, Kampala Dreaming, or even the Harare Hospital Romance series? I have no questions and answers, but I also have faith there are ample examples of solutions and innovations. The excellent Chris Abani is editing the forthcoming Lagos Noir for Akashic Books, and Lauren Bukes, whose book is on sale outside, and Nendi Okorafor, to name only two, are African prize-winning science fiction writers. Binyawanga's own Kwani is in the closing stage of a continent-wide hunt for unpublished manuscripts, with special encouragement for genre and other writing outside the mainstream. This last venture, along with Goretti's work with the African Writers Trust, facilitating the sharing of skills towards building a vibrant publishing industry in Uganda, shows what is possible when publishing professionals, literary activists, and promoters of books challenge themselves to meet the potential of our writers. Earlier, when I said that ours is the first generation with power to make change, I meant this. We know the writers are there, and the potential to have an impact on the world stage has been demonstrated. Where one goes, others see possibilities and follow. But the faces of the decision makers and gatekeepers often do not reflect our own. If you're not sitting at the table, you're probably lunch. African literature, if we are to call it that, needs publishers, editors, marketing executives, and booksellers who are insistent in seeking out the stories we want to read. Writers have no obligation to teach, promote political agendas, to right historical wrongs, or to take on the burden of representing an entire nation, let alone a continent. Their calling as storytellers and their jobs as writers is to hone their craft. Quality, to my mind, is just as important, if not more so, as the message. If we insist that the writing that we're seeking out and publish is the best there is, it will find its audience, and it will encourage more. The deserved recognition of the commercial and cultural potential of our writers cannot be allowed only to benefit Western audiences and publishing houses. Where we, and I mean all of us in this room, have skills, we have an obligation to share, to take what we know, to create and to support opportunities for young, proofreaders, copy editors, commissioning editors, and booksellers who lack the backing of an established industry to grow their own. This investment in the back room that makes books possible will, I am certain, create an environment and an industry that will ensure that we are not trapped into always importing our books from elsewhere. And we have to put our money where our mouths are. Books shouldn't be free. This is a business, just as Nollywood is a business. If our energies are as focused on creating viable commercial opportunities, our initiatives will have a longer life and a wider reach. But I don't want this to become a policy speech, and perhaps it's better done by others. And the truth is, I am much more interested in the dreaming up of potential futures and the intensely practical business of publishing than I am on mapping out instructions for anyone else. But what I want to emphasize, and as we browse the books and speak this afternoon, and listen to the writers here today, is that the changes are ours to make. Thank you.
So I thought it was really smart. I got these questions on my cue cards, but I think they're going to be a little bit useless now after that. Okay. It's very interesting what both speakers have said, Ellah and Goretti. I really, I picked up on a few things as both of you were speaking. And the first thing you said, which, kind of made sense from, put everything in perspective, was talking about the margins. And so my first question is this: how come we're, within those margins or outside of the center point that you mentioned for so long? What are the reasons for that gap? And as such, how would you describe the current state of African publishing? And now, who controls it?
Wow. I'm sure you expect me to say something very intelligent.
Well, controversial would be nice.
Well, I think there's a long history to all that. Because I always use my own example. That I started writing, I started reading and writing and studying literature while still living on the continent. So I have both experiences. So when I moved here in 2007, and met many African writers who have found success in Europe and in America, I remember how amazed I was at that. And when I started interacting with them, and realizing that, these writers actually are taking even some of the basic things I didn't have in Uganda for granted. Things like electricity. Mm-hmm. I had to get used to the fact that I could actually have electricity all week round. Whenever there was a program on TV which I desperately wanted to watch, I would catch myself saving it. Recording it, and then my husband would laugh at me and say, "Why are you doing that?" I said, "Oh, because we may not have power on Wednesday." He said, "Oh, I can see where you're coming from." So I had to get used to the idea that actually I have electricity to write, I can have access to internet, and I can attend literary events. It takes a lot of effort to organize something like this in Africa. So I have to get used to the idea that every weekend I can actually, go online and find where a literary activity is happening at the South Bank, at this place. So I kept thinking, where have I been? I think you can't help thinking like that. Where have I been? What have we been doing at Femwrite, trying to write and publish? I've already touched on the things, like very small readership, very narrow markets. Publishing ventures that are not commercially viable at all. The way the education system we've gone through, where you sit in the class and you are not allowed to challenge anything. You are not allowed to let your imagination roam and write what you feel like writing. Where if you're a woman, it is still a surprise that you're writing and publishing. When I tried my hand at what I would call sexy romantic sewing, I published a novella which is called Whispers from Veil. And it was very naughty, it was very explicit. And when it was published, and the reviews that came out, they all had sorts of headlines. the book you cannot read with your mother-in-law. And then I got a visitor in my office, a tall, very tall, athletic-looking soldier with his fatigues, you know, and a pistol. And he walked into my office and said, "Oh, I've come to talk to you. I've come to talk to Vera." I said, "No, I'm not Vera." He said, "No, you wrote that book called Whispers from Vera." And you know, and he had a section which was very explicit, and I was talking about a woman having masturbation. It was very explicit, and later I looked back and said, "Oh, why did I do that?" And I want to talk to you about this because I have a problem and I want you to solve it. I have a problem. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is, you know, you are coming from such a culture. So that book actually sold out. Unfortunately, the publisher collapsed. So it's not, I don't even have a personal copy anymore. So it was on the market for just about a year. So that was my attempt at, you know, trying to break these boundaries. I can write what I want. So you have to deal with all that. We still have to grapple with all that. You know, if you write such a book, you have to be very courageous. Because I got a lot of negative publicity. And then it was serialized in one of the leading newspapers. And they put my picture alongside. The woman who writes about sex, the woman. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I'm trying to say there is still a lot to grapple with. So I always compare that with when I come here and listen to writers reading very explicit sex scenes, and nobody is cringing. People are looking so straight-faced. So you can't do that in Uganda. So we are still coming from all that.
I think that also sort of leads back to what you were talking about earlier, Goretti, when you were saying that, you know, one comes from an educational system where there's a standard way of doing things that automatically does feed into literary fiction. And Belinda, your question about who's controlling the publishing, I think that the two are inevitably connected, and you'll see that Macmillan, Random House and Penguin all have big divisions now in African countries. And the reason for that is not any kind of outreach or wanting to help, it's because they see a commercial potential there. And the more that's published, the more writers like Goretti are writing those kind of books, and the more that sort of science fiction writers or Mukoma Wangugi's crime set in South Africa, the more that those in Nairobi rather, the more that those stories are out there, the more possibility there is, and it becomes a vibrant market. But it really has to start from an investment in the publishing industry itself, not necessarily in the writers, because I don't think that's where the problem is at all.
Okay, that's very interesting. And do you think this kind of takes me to the question about the challenges, some of which you touched on? First of all, we've got the way people are educated. Some things, you know, like for example, in my house, there are some books you just did not bring home, or you're finished for the week, as it is. But I went to a school where there was a library, there were books, but still we had a scripture union. So some people did not see you with certain books after scripture union. So you kind of, and I was very scripture union. In fact, I was scripture unionized. But the thing is, when you now look at the challenges now, I find that sometimes people publish more books to do with education or what they think will sell in schools or what the school authorities and universities will put an order in for rather than the one that they consider to be risky. What's the mindset that needs to change in order to break that barrier down?
It's not just the mindset though. A novel, you know, I hear about a new book that I want. I go onto Amazon and I buy it for half price discount. The price of that novel does not equal what I'm going to be feeding my children or the pair of shoes that my daughter needs. There's no comparison. I have more disposable income and I can spend it on books. If the price of a book is so high that the decision is, do I buy this for my child or this textbook for my child, or do I buy a novel? The novel is never going to compete. It's a luxury item. And until there's a decent volume of locally produced books that allow the price points to come to a point at which it doesn't become that kind of very difficult decision, which it is for the vast majority of people on the continent, at least in my country, that's the reality, then we're not going to get the variety that we want. And it's not, I really don't think it's about a mindset. I mean, I was speaking to a young writer earlier on, in which we were arguing over the fact that, people will say that people in this country don't read or people in that country don't read. There are reasons for that, and we also need to know that, we're not the first to ever love books or to want to immerse ourselves in or to want to write them. There's a little girl somewhere in Zivarasekwa in Zimbabwe who's born to be an editor. And it's about, is she ever going to get that chance to do it? And, given the chance, her mindset would be right there.
Okay.
And maybe to add on that, it's a bit, it disturbs me that even when we're able to publish, I'll keep going back to Feminite, we publish a book, and it's, as you say, completely out of reach for a teacher, for example, or even a university lecturer who earns about £600 a month, and the teacher earns maybe a quarter of that. And then we still have to go to donor agencies like British Council and ask them to buy these books and donate to secondary schools. So I know it's a good thing because students will read it and young people read the book, but how is that sustainable? How can that support the publishing industry in Africa? We still have to go to a Dutch embassy in Uganda and beg them, please, can you buy 200 copies of this book so we can get them to this university, and they will do it.
But the message being given is that books should be given away for free.
Yeah, so that's why I'm saying that still disturbs me. How can we...
So how do we begin to convince? It's okay. How do we begin to convince the consumers, the readers, the audience that these books have been written for, created for, that books should not be for free? If there's a library,
that's the impression that
exactly.
When you go to British Council and they buy 200 copies,
the
kind price. They're already talking of going to British Council Kampala so that they can buy the anthology from the kind price to give to schools.
Yeah, but I think the answer here is, this is why, the topic of the panel is so interesting. But I think the answer is with genre fiction. So for example, when my dad was starting out in writing, if he wrote a short story and published it in Drum, people could buy it. And he got paid for his writing, therefore, he could sustain himself and eventually educate himself. But to some extent, it was pulp fiction, really. These are easy morality tales and stories, or if somebody's writing, the spaghetti westerns, the cowboy stories. If we're encouraging that kind of genre fiction that's cheap, and people are buying it, so the guy who's going to work as a gardener, who has a basic education, but not a very high reading level, but also wants to consume stories, and we know this because Nollywood is booming, not because people in England are buying those movies, but because local people buy the DVDs in great volumes. So we know that there's an appetite for culture and easily digestible stories that are coming from their own places. But the literary world just hasn't tapped into that at all yet. People buy music, because it's sung in language that they understand, it's about their own lives and so on. And so it's encouraging the genre writers at the very commercial end of the literary spectrum to be producing things that are cheap, really, for people to, and then you build a reading culture out of that, along with the publishing at the higher end.
And this visibility is an issue because, when people talk about African publishing, we just say African publishing, but Africa has over 50 countries where you have publishers in different countries. But sometimes you go to a meeting and the people on the panel just group everybody as one. Do you think it would help if, for example, when you're talking about African publishing, like we're doing here right now, and you're able to talk about the different publishers in different places and the area of focus, do you think if we were to create that kind of atmosphere where it's more obvious to people what this publisher does or what that publisher does, that it will generate more interest to go out and get those particular books? Because sometimes, I have to be honest, as a journalist, when you're trying to contact a publisher because you want to do a story about them, you practically feel like you're begging them to give you an interview. And I'm thinking, I don't have time for this. So is that another thing that publishers need to be more aware? They need to become more market savvy and more, because sometimes it feels like the business approach is missing. They just want to publish books, but they don't know how to sell it. So that's why you might call a publisher, they'll tell you, oh, we're really busy right now. You wait for an image for their book for 3 days when you're on the deadline. So how do you bridge that gap?
Well, Goretti and I did some really interesting work together earlier this year in Kampala. We were focusing on training publishers, and we had people there who were from magazines, from big publishing houses and so on. And it was incredibly fascinating. I think I learned as much as hopefully the people who are on the course were. But it is about allowing publishing professionals in the countries the space to actually think and reflect about their industry and the kind of industry that they want to grow, and supporting that. That's what I meant about sort of having that obligation to take what we understand. You're speaking about the publicity department, but we understand about, you'll phone Penguin here and you'll get a really quick response because they want you to write about their book. Or I will email you and say, do you know that I'm publishing this great young Nigerian writer? And that same kind of interaction still isn't there. But I don't think it's because of a lack of will. I think it's just a way of doing business that needs to evolve to become viable. I don't know if Goretti wants to add to.
And I still think that the main target for these publishers are still educational, most of the publishing. So I don't think they understand how much revenue, for example, article generate for this book. I don't know how the relationship between somebody reading the review in a newspaper and then going to buy that book. Because when they talk of a marketing department, for example in Uganda, the marketing department of a publisher is to do with secondary schools, it's to do with universities. So when they talk of a marketing strategy, it is going to schools. It's having a big campaign to go to schools, to go to universities, where they think the book will be bought. I don't think they consider the media approach.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, moving on from that, before we go to the audience for questions, digital publishing. I've heard a few people argue that that's what's going to really, really revive Africa's publishing industry. But I was in Nigeria in June, and I know the issues I had with phone connection. So, so I'm not quite sure yet if you cannot download something on your phone, how you're gonna get a PDF to open. But here in the West, we can see what e-books and digital publishing is doing to print. People have predicted the death of print. Fingers crossed it doesn't happen because I'm here to write my book. But when you look at both worlds and then you as an editor, as a publisher, and you do the same thing, and you take a step back and you assess the situation, do you agree with the sentiment that digital publishing is the way out? And why do you take that stance? And if not, why?
I don't think we need a way out, because I think there's always going to be room for the printed book. You don't need electricity or a connection to anything to read a book, and the content is always going to come through that medium. But at the same time, I love the idea of digital futures. I think that there's so many potential ways it could go, and because we don't know, we may as well just be prepared. And the preparation is about finding the writers and editing the writers really well, so the content is there in whatever medium. This year, for the first time, the Kane Prize did a deal with a graphic novel company that took all of the Kane, I don't know if any of you saw them, they took all of the Kane Prize stories and made them into graphic novel representations. It was wonderful. A lot of discussion about whether or not we should be doing this kind of thing, whether it's high literature or not, but the reach is much wider, because that can be published in a Sunday newspaper, which people can buy very cheaply, and then they've at least been exposed to the work of the Kane Prize shortlisted candidates and can be inspired to write their own stories and enter them. And so I think all of these different platforms do offer exciting opportunities, as long as there's always the acknowledgement that the content has to be of high quality at the very beginning. I don't think it's anything to be afraid of.
And Goretti?
Yeah, I think so, because I also think that we need to think of the infrastructure to develop room for digital publishing and reading. When Ni was in Uganda, I saw him reading from his Amazon Kindle. Were you able to download anything from Uganda?
I don't use it to read bought books. I used to read people's manuscripts, actually. So, yeah.
So I still think that the infrastructure is still a big problem.
And the cost, I mean, you're saying about how you use it. I offered my father a Kindle before he left to go back to Zimbabwe, and he looked at me and said, how much will it cost? And I said, it's not expensive. He said, how much will it cost? And when I told him, he said, well, no. And would rather have the book. And it was prohibitive because that amount of money represents something quite huge. And as Goretti was saying, the difficulty of downloading it. But everyone's got a cheap mobile phone. Almost everyone's got at least some kind of access to one of those devices. And those short bursts of storytelling through subscription and so on, at a very low price point, are something that a lot of innovative publishers are doing. So,
we're going to the audience. Does anyone got any questions, please?
So lots of note taking, so don't be shy.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a comment actually. There's not a question, and it's from the Nigerian context, which I think possibly, possibly we might say Nigeria is maybe a bit different from other places in Africa. I think the Nigerian middle class, middle class or elite class, has a lot of money actually. And in my experience of publishing in Nigeria, I would say that rather than money being the issue for that particular segment, which again in the Nigerian context is actually large enough for that to be a market for a publisher, at least in the first instance. In my experience, there is a mindset issue as opposed to a disposable income issue when it comes to buying books. I mean, so like we had events at, upmarket events or events at schools, again, upmarket schools, and people just wouldn't buy books. They're just not interested. And it's not because they don't have the money.
even if the author is Nigerian?
Yeah. Especially, I mean, for me, it was especially the schools that I found shocking. So we'd had I remember one event, and I was there, and I was there with my book. I mean, there were other books there as well, but, I was there, and I left the event, and at the end of the day, when the team came back, the sales I couldn't believe the sales. They were pitiful. And I actually spoke, it was actually World Book Day, so that was why I was invited. I was invited as an author, and I spoke about the value of reading, blah, 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 to the parents who all looked disinterested. And like I said, I left the team there selling books, and they came back with like 16,000 naira sales, which is like, $100. I was really shocked. And in my, again, what I think is that, and I think maybe sort of what Goretti was getting at, in terms of the education system, the education system in Nigeria, at least, is one where you're not encouraged, as you said, to sort of think, or, imagination is shut down. It's very literal. What you learn in class, in your notes, is what you then have to sort of remember for the exam and recite it. So something like reading, people would say to me all the time, I don't read things that don't have a direct learning point. Or, there's some phrase, I don't know whether that's a business school phrase, people would say to me. So I don't read fiction because there's no direct benefit. That was the sort of attitude that I would hear, and I think it's linked to the education system because, again, it's so literal. So the idea of just reading for reading's sake or reading to sort of just generally broaden your horizons just does not fit into that education system, and then people just carry that attitude forward. I mean, so again, in a very specific class I'm referring to, but I just don't think it was money.
Yeah, but I think you also have to think of who makes up this so-called middle class. Because in Uganda we have a saying that either we don't have what would be a middle class. Either you are in the elite group, so we have a saying that either you belong to the president's family and you are rich and elite, or you are a university professor and you are poor.
I'm referring to
that elite, then they wouldn't be interested in
this. Yeah, no, she's referring to the elite.
So they wouldn't be interested. So we don't have that middle class that would appreciate buying books if they had the money.
I'd be really interested to hear from you what you think the solution is, because I can't see how sort of mere publishers can change a whole nation's education system. And I'm really interested in what it is in our power to change, because those same elites, I bet, and please correct me if I'm wrong, are buying religious texts, sort of inspirational books or business books, for example.
Yeah, that's what you see being sold.
And I think that then comes back to money, because those books do fuel a publishing house to be able to publish literary fiction, and at some point the influence has to be made. I don't think it's a battle that one can't win, otherwise we will have to just give up. And so I wonder what you think about the possible solutions, given that we're not writing education policy.
Well, I mean, I do think, again, I mean, from my experience, I do think that, as I said, it's a mindset, and I feel like when you do sort of breach it in little ways, then you sort of open up the gates, as it were, because then another sort of experience is people would say, like when you sort of persuade them or convince them, spend 1,000 naira, which is £4, which is what people spent on credit or that's credit for their phone or Nollywood or other forms of entertainment very quickly. When you do convince them, then there's a sense in which they sort of come back and see, oh, I actually really enjoyed that. There's a certain, they see the value of it. So I do think that possibly lighter fiction, if you want to call it that, or genre fiction, might actually be a way of shifting that. So it's not just like a big Chimamanda book, which is 300 pages, which people might think, that's a bit sort of heavy or boring, but just more entertainment. And then, as you said, publishing in newspapers or serializing so that people can, again, read something and then be interested in reading it the next week, follow up, and so on. Or even, as you said, sending, and something that Farafina was talking about, sending out content digitally to phones. So again, it would be short content, but as a way of sort of hooking people, as it were. I mean, I think those are possible ways of creating the interest.
Yeah, and I think what you said is very interesting because I started reading because the school I used to go to gave me books because I won a race during our inter-house sport or something like that, and my gift was a pile of books. And I remember my parents came to pick me up and said, we have a professor in the making. I don't think they studied journalism or anything like that. So that's where my passion for reading kicked into action. So to hear you say that, like, fair enough, I've been away for 16 years before I went back in June. And sometimes when my siblings wanted books, I had to get books from here and send to them. And I remember one day I said to my sister, just go to the library, I'm sure they have it. And everybody said, laughing, which library are you talking about? So it's interesting to hear you say that.
Yes, I still want to help in her own comment because my husband is a writer, and we are having almost the same experience, especially the media in Nigeria. For instance, they called him for an interview, a program. We had two musicians, These two musicians, a small boy of maybe 3, 4, 5 years, he was given about 1 hour to talk. Another musician to perform. It's serious, Another musician, I don't know whether reggae musician or whatever, was given about 45 minutes or so. But my husband was given about 5-10 minutes to talk about his book. So how do you expect the younger generation to pick to reading? When, for instance, in the TV station, such an allocation of time was made. This is one. Then again, coming into the system, the educational system, you see, when we were in school, it was obligatory that you have to at least read a book, a novel in a week. And you must come to the class and say what the book is all about. Because if we continue talking, we are just prescribing, but we have to get to the system. What is actually happening in Africa?
The mindsets and everything else, the longer we spend talking about all of those things and piling on the problems, the longer it's going to take for us to find solutions. And that's, both Goretti and I, as we were speaking, were saying these are the things that we can do. And it's really important that we do those things. And there are going to be mindset problems. There are going to be elites who are more interested in design issues than books. There are going to be governments that suppress writers and suppress their people so they can't afford books. Those are the realities of the situation. But what can we do to move things along and to change them? And there are things that are happening, and we have to make sure that we're supporting those.
I just wonder whether or not maybe our routine, because I'm even thinking about this thing of books being turned into films, and you'll even find people who go and watch the film, and maybe half of them, if not more, haven't actually read the book, and are still not inspired to read the book as a result of watching the film. And so I wonder whether or not, in the same way as we grew up on this diet of Western literature, and very good literature as it was, that gave us our initial appreciation for reading and literature in itself. And then we got to a point where we thought, I can't identify with these characters, I want to read characters that are about characters that are like me. And I wonder whether or not our routine is to reverse that process and have our own writers exporting their stuff to, the Western cultures maybe who will spend that money on books. And then when we get successful that way, eventually our own people will appreciate our writers. It's not ideal, but it's a suggestion.
No, I think that, earlier on in my presentation, I think that that's happening already, and I love that image of the tap and the water gushing, because I think that there's so much work that happens from the very beginning, where a writer says, okay, you can publish my book, but who's going to buy it in Nigeria, and can they buy it? That forces a publishing house to find a way to make that happen, because they want to make money to the book being out there and available. And I think it's happening now, and there's no dearth of talent. They're writers and writers and writers of different textures and abilities who are doing really good work.
Question, sorry. It's also directed to Ellah. It has to do with marketing, because I don't want to be too sort of negative, but again, in my experience in Nigeria, if the editorial team went out and sold books at events, which we did sometimes, then we made sales. But then when the marketing team, well, what we call the marketing or sales, it turns out that most of the people on the team, they weren't necessarily book lovers, and they actually hadn't really read the book, so they couldn't actually really speak about them. So I wondered, it's true, it's a job, they sell books, but they can't actually tell you which book is good or what it's about or whatever. So I just wondered how it works here in the UK, say, whether the sales team or the people who are sort of out there are what the criteria is for this kind of people. Are they just random people who just
sometimes we face the same problem. When it works well, the sales director is involved at the acquisition process, and so they're there when you're talking about the book initially, and there are very clear procedures for providing information to the sales team, who actually in the end can't read all of the books that they're supposed to sell, so providing clear information sheets. But often, and especially with the kind of books that I want to publish, it's about the editor having to go to the sales team saying, read this, or let me tell you the story about it, and this is why it's going to work, and this is how you talk about it when you go out there. It's always a battle. I think it's one thing that we should all consider when we're talking about the problems of growing in African publishing industries. And often the problems that are faced, and I certainly found this in Uganda when I came to Nigeria to work with writers and with publishers and editors, that the problems that we often think are local and because of our special situation are actually international problems. They're the problems of publishing. Because if you think about books and people who read them, it's a small number of people in any kind of population, and we're trying to saturate that market. And so it's always going to be, there always going to be more people who want to go watch James Bond than to actually read Ian Fleming, at any level. And so I think that, at least in England and America, there are systems in the established publishing industry that does inform the sales and marketing teams. And that's why both Goretti and I was saying that part of the solution is an investment in the back room of the whole publishing industry, and not entirely a focus only on the writers.